Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Naomi Slipp from the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Naomi serves as the Douglas and Cynthia Crocker Endowed Chair for the Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning. Together with Maura Coughlin from Northeastern University, Naomi is one of the curators of the fascinating exhibition entitled A Singularly Marine and Fabulous Produce, the Cultures of Seaweed, which is on display from now until December 3rd. During the program, we're finding out why and how the exhibition came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the past cultures of seaweed and its applications today and into the future. Let's start by meeting Naomi and hearing all about the cultures of seaweed and some of the many other programs, events, and other opportunities at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Welcome, Naomi. So delighted you're able to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jay. I'm so pleased to be invited. Thank you for having me.
I had the wonderful opportunity just the other day to visit the museum, tour the exhibition, learned a lot, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you just spend a brief time sharing somewhat your background, current position, and what attracted you to the museum.
Sure. So I got my first museum sort of experience when I was in high school. I joined the docent corps at Blythewald Mansion and Gardens in Bristol, Rhode Island, which is my hometown. And I loved working there. I particularly loved giving tours of the Arboretum. It's a 45-acre property. And so I started doing that in my teens, and that was the beginning, so to speak, of my professional museum career. But I think like many museum goers, I grew up going to museums, always was fascinated by museums and displays, was interested in collecting and what that meant and what kinds of stories you could tell from collections. And so Blythewald in many ways was a beginning, but then during my professional career, I was able to branch out and gain deeper knowledge in subject area as well. So I mostly worked in terms of my academic study in the history of 19th century American art, but looked often at the intersections between sort of different cultures around that story, and also the intersections between art and science, which has been a big sort of project area for me. So thinking about that and thinking about sort of where I've landed, I guess it sort of made perfect sense when this position came open, the chief curator position at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It brought me home. First of all, I had been teaching. I was a tenured associate professor of art history at Auburn University in Central Alabama. I'd been there for 6 years. So this brought me closer to home, back to my coastal New England roots. But it also is an institution that, if you know it, is so uniquely interdisciplinary and so tied up in the intersections between history, art, science, and culture that it really kind of melded beautifully so many of the different parts of the work I had done in the past, projects I had led. So it presented opportunities that were really exciting to me and continue to be exciting based on our institution and our collection.
Now, and as we're going to hear shortly, a wonderful mapping your background with the current exhibition couldn't be any stronger. And we are going to get to that in just a moment. But
Mhm,
for those maybe not as familiar with the museum itself,
mhm,
share a few words, very briefly, maybe the history, the mission, and
mhm.
a sampling of what's available for the general public.
Sure. Yeah. So we were founded in 1903 as the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. We just celebrated our 120th anniversary. Old Dartmouth is the region of roughly 7 towns on the south coast that we're centered in New Bedford. And so we've always collected the kind of regional history of the area because New Bedford was such a center of the American whaling industry. A big part of that collection and story has always been on American whaling. But interestingly, I always like to tell people this when talking about our history. Our first building, which the Historical Society acquired in 1906, had 5 galleries. And it remains that they give you a sense of the focus then, and it remains true to our collection today. There was a gallery devoted to textiles, to colonial history, to whaling, to photography, and to the South Pacific or Oceania. Today, 120 years later, our collection is about 1 million items, including rare books and manuscripts, quilts, whaleboats, works on paper, photography, everything and anything in between that, a historical society of this size and age would collect. Um, so you can see here, our campus is also quite extensive. Today, the museum spans across 10 buildings and occupies a full city block. If you can follow along 3 buildings down there with the flag, the bronze flag hanging off, that was our very first building, acquired again in 1906. It's a bank building. And that's today a space occupied by our special exhibitions or rotating exhibit spaces. But we have over 14 permanent galleries across the museum, and they tell local history. They talk about the story of whaling, both locally and globally. We focus on the industries that were important to the region beyond whaling, including glass production and textile production. And increasingly, the museum has shifted its mission and focus to the more kind of pressing issues of today, including relevant to our regional historical ties to whaling, whale conservation, marine mammal health, and increasingly the impacts of climate change on our oceans and our world. So you're seeing actually the first gallery that visitors enter into. It's not focused on whaling. It's not even focused on the land per se. It's focused on the whales themselves, the creatures that drove the industry and development of this area. And we're very lucky to have 5 fully articulated whale skeletons in the museum collection, which allow us to educate and teach audiences about the real issues that are facing marine mammals today and impacting their survival. So we have
Now,
incredible partnerships that help us do that kind of work.
now
The
this
museum's mission statement, sorry.
continue,
Yeah,
please.
I was just so the museum's mission statement is very succinct, but it also allows a lot of different avenues for exploration. So the New Bedford Whaling Museum ignites learning through explorations of art, history, science, and culture rooted in the stories of people, the region, and an international seaport.
Nice, nice. Well, there's so much more we could hear about the museum in general, programs, events, education,
Mhm,
and the contact information will be in the credits. And if we have a minute at the end, we can get back to it. But
mhm.
definitely want to spend the bulk of our time now talking about the cultures of seaweed. And
Yeah.
first, just why and how did it come about?
It's a great question. This actually started from my job talk at the museum. So I was interviewing for the chief curator position. I was invited to come up to Massachusetts again. At that time, I was in central Alabama. And a couple of days before my visit, I was given a list of objects in the collection to choose one to give a lecture on while I was up there. And it was a diversity of objects from a pretty diverse collection. But the one that really spoke to me was a 19th century painting by an American artist. So an area, again, that's quite, my area of specialty, and a work that speaks to the kind of coastal commons and the economy of seaweed. Um, again, I in my past have worked a lot at the intersection of art and science, particularly around coastal commons, and for me, the sort of birth of marine fisheries and sort of that area. But knew enough about seaweed as an economic engine to be comfortable exploring that for a lecture that then immediately, once I started the position, became the seed for this exhibition. So we've been working on it for 2 years now, which is how long I've been at the museum. And it is a loan show that comprises over 125 works from 33 different lenders, including some quite large institutions who contributed to the project by lending their works to us. There's pretty exciting things, I think, in the exhibition that really help us to explore the variety and ways in which seaweed has been depicted, but also the way it's been used. So that one painting and that talk were the beginning, but then it spun out from there.
Yeah, I think once you visit, you'll be amazed and in awe of the range of items that have incorporated seaweed. Wonderful array of artwork that we'll shortly hear. For those who haven't had the chance to visit yet, would you please share some of the curatorial considerations and how the exhibition's laid out, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the museum, our special exhibition space is small by museum standards. It's about 2,500 square feet, and it's an unusual space. As I mentioned earlier, this is in our first building, the Historical Society's first building. It was built as a bank. What I've heard anecdotally is the tile floor was the public area, the wood floor was the staff area, and if you can imagine a sort of teller wall between that broke off the public and private parts of the bank. So we have our exhibition space in here now, and it has some unusual architectural features. It also has some sort of natural spatial breaks. And so we really had to work within that footprint like most institutions do. But the first consideration was really the scale or scope of the show. Because we were working with about 2,500 square feet, we knew we needed to create a tight enough narrative that visitors would be able to understand and see the correspondences between place and time. You know, it could have been a sort of seaweed catch-all. We could have easily have gone global with this show, right? But we used the Swift painting, which people can see at the end there. This is the work from our collection that inspired the project as the sort of the point of intersection to frame the defining narrative of the show. So Swift, the American artist of this painting, was born in Acushnet, Massachusetts, within our region, which is why we have the work. He actually designs the seal for the Historical Society in 1903. He paints that painting in Brittany, France, where he is living for about 10 years. And so from there, we decided that the show would be about New England, it would be about Brittany, and it would be about the southeastern coast of France. And once we had that triangle, which literally that kind of geography frames the same tides, it frames the same seaweed distribution, we were able to kind of use that as our springboard for the cultures of seaweed that we would explore. That's not to say that there aren't incredible traditions in Southeast Asia or within indigenous communities, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. Our early checklist was everywhere and everything. But as we kind of drew that triangle, that really helped us frame the exhibit. And I think ultimately what we end up with in that space is quite successful in telling a story that's still quite varied and interesting. Um,
Most definitely. And also current
mhm,
connections and
mhm,
even into the future as well as
mhm,
part of the exhibition. As
mhm,
we've been touring with some of the images in the background,
mhm,
we can see wide range of
mhm,
artwork and other items.
mhm.
How were
Yeah.
they obtained and just a sense of the range of places they've come from?
hmm That's a great question. And I will say first, you're sort of right now, we're kind of moving through the first space of the exhibit. And this space is really oriented around the shoreline economy of seaweed, the gathering of seaweed, who's doing the gathering, and then the birth of phycology or the study of seaweed as a scientific discipline, and how all those things intersect and really bloom in the 1840s and 50s. Right now, you're looking through the silver case at the back of that gallery, which was a really fun decision. We sort of bifurcated the gallery into these two big spaces. And this first one is really about the people gathering, right? And the gathering itself. And then that second space over there is sort of the art and design of seaweed in some ways. So the silver in some ways would have been more natural on the other side of the gallery, I guess I'm saying. But I loved including it here because you have this juxtaposition between the most elite, extraordinary, fabulous, expensive, beautiful decorative arts. This is silver designed by Tiffany and by Gorham Manufacturing Company. The 4 pieces of Tiffany we have came directly from the Tiffany Company collection, which is their private archive. And so you have that juxtaposed with people gathering the seaweed, working class people gathering the seaweed on the shoreline for the commons, right? To sell it, to make whatever money they can, or to use it for farming. There's such a kind of tension there, I think, in thinking about class and in thinking about how seaweed crossed over all these different levels, which was a lot of fun to play with in this one arrangement. The objects themselves, as I noted, that one piece came from the Tiffany Company collection. We have works on loan from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, from Historic New England, from the RISD Museum, from the Yale University Art Gallery, from the Yale Center for British Art, from the Boston Athenaeum, the Colby College Museum of Art. I could go on and on and on. It's a pretty extraordinary list of lenders, and we were very lucky to have full support in the project and real collaboration around being able to bring works or exhibit works that are challenging. Many of these are extraordinarily light sensitive. Many of them are very fragile. The Yale Center for British Art, in fact, which lent a number of albums of actual seaweed specimens, came back with some pretty specific restrictions on how we could exhibit and what we could exhibit because seaweed itself is so light sensitive. So you'll see in those albums we're exhibiting brown algae specimens because they're less sensitive to light than green and red. And there's a very specific angle that the albums can be left open at. But they were incredibly accommodating in allowing us to exhibit them at all, right? Really wanted to support the project and work with us on it. So we feel very lucky in that regard. This incredible object that you see in the back of this image, that's house insulation. Wow. That's stuffed with eelgrass that was manufactured in the Boston area at the turn of the 20th century. It's been found in houses as far away as California. Eelgrass and seaweed were used as house insulation as far back as the 1600s. There's a house in Dorchester, the Pierce House, that had seaweed in it as insulation in 1630. So we wanted to include that, but that huge piece of house insulation is on loan to us from the Mystic Seaport Museum. And I think, gives a sense of kind of all the different ways seaweed gets utilized in different industries. You mentioned as well the future. You'll see, viewers will see on the left side there, those panels, which we collaborated with the Nature Conservancy on the content for. They were one of the partners for the exhibition. We had an incredible group of scientists and aquaculturists who helped advise on the sort of modern applications of seaweed and have been a part of our exhibit programming because we really did want to bring it up to today. The exhibition in many ways is historical. We have the participation of 12 contemporary artists. So their work also kind of shows how art is focusing on seaweed. But seaweed, it's a little world, a kind of microcosm of individuals, at least the seaweed science and aquaculture side, who are, as I got to dive deep into it for this project, they're all working together to answer some of the most pressing kind of questions that we face today. They're thinking about global food scarcity. They're thinking about eutrophied waterways and how seaweed aquaculture can improve coastal biodiversity and also water clarity. They're looking at it as a biofuel. There's like all sorts of different ways that seaweed is being explored today, many to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So it's really incredible. And that's been fun in and of itself, just in that little kind of dive to get to explore that world.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, who knew that seaweed had all these uses, potential, cross-disciplinary connections? Really fascinating. Well, in the time left, we are fortunate to have some nice close-up shots of several of the individual items, and we'll just give a sampling. And I think best place to start is with the centerpiece, Seaweed
Mhm.
Gatherers by Clement Nye Swift, and can let viewers get a nice close look here. If you just like to point out a few of the features that you find most compelling.
Yeah. So again, Swift was a local kid to our coast, right? And I think, he lived in France for 10 years and he really became interested and invested in Brittany. And I think there was a shared commonality, right? They're kind of a coastal upbringing and the way working class people found opportunity in whatever was there. Seaweed is what we describe as the rack. It's the stuff that washes up at the high tide line, right? It's a weed by name, but then it was adapted for so many different uses, particularly by people who had limited economic means, right? And would stretch everything to make it work. So first, I would say I think Swift is drawn to this subject and gives them a humanity and a sensitivity because I think it felt familiar to him. But you can see this is a traditional realist picture for people who are interested in that kind of history. But what that means is you can really get a sense of that working class labor, of the effort, of the work that goes into this, of the gathering of seaweed. But then here, like that strong diagonal composition, the three figures at the back of the cart who are putting all of their weight into trying to push it through the sand. You see the deep ruts, right, that the wheels have created. And then this horizon line that just sort of stretches into the distance in the left that goes on and on and on. And you can imagine, how hard the work is ahead of them to get that cart to the factory where it's likely going to be used to produce iodine.
Nice,
Um,
nice.
so it's an incredible picture. It's also very large, which may be hard to tell for people looking at the scene, but it's over 40 inches by 93 inches, and it was painted as an exhibit picture. So Swift exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1878, which
Wonderful,
is pretty
wonderful.
great.
Well, let's move on and a few
Yeah.
words about what we're seeing here, please.
hmm Yeah, so this is an incredible object. It's a matching jug and basin or ewer and basin set created by a French manufacturing company in Krill. And it is a mocha ware pattern. Mocha ware became popular utilizing literally a kind of a mocha stone, which is sort of an agate stone. It's a naturally occurring stone that has this sort of pattern where the crystallization of the agate grows into the rock surface. And originally, as I understand, they would use the stone to press, but then increasingly they would do different kinds of applications to get this look of the stone. And it became very popular, and it's dendritic, right? It looks like trees
Mm.
sometimes or feathers, but there are certain applications of it that look like seaweed. And so this is one of the examples of mocha ware that we included in the exhibition that have this really seaweedy look to them. Um, we started looking at mocha ware as just a bit of a byway, but there's an incredible watercolor in the exhibition by Andrew Wyeth of a lobster riding up onto a coastline in a foaming sea of seaweed. This is an early watercolor by Wyeth, painted in 1940, and it's pretty spectacularly abstract. Um, but we knew we would have Wyeth in the show early, and Wyeth and his wife Betsy actually collected mocha ware, and they had it on display in their house in coastal Maine. And so we were thinking about those connections, the way kind of the seaweed forms on ceramics would influence artists and back and forth, right? And the seaweed itself shows up in the work, and how much kind of lovely synergy there is there. So this is exhibited quite close to the Wyeth watercolor that we've included in the show too. So in my mind, they're linked.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
What are we enjoying here?
So this is one page from a pretty incredible souvenir album that was created in California that combines seaweeds and photographs of the California coastline. This is one of a group of albums like this that were available for tourists early in the 1900s in Southern California and Northern California. This is from Monterey. This was collected by our museum because the cover of the book is actually made of whalebone. And it's not solid pieces of whalebone, it's joined pieces of whalebone that create a kind of herringbone pattern,
Mm.
which is pretty spectacular in and of itself. But this specimen, I think, is just so beautiful because you imagine, specimen collecting is a big part of the show. There are a lot of examples of real seaweed, but what they would do is sort of catch it and then float it and sort of try and arrange the parts of the seaweed while it was floating and then lift it up onto the paper. And the adhesion to the paper is literally just this natural wet stickiness of the seaweed itself. None of these are done with any glues. And you can see all the little fronds and the way they're sort of perfectly arranged here in this beautiful kind of specimen. But totally aesthetic, right? And
as we make our way
mhm,
through some of these other
mhm,
items that visitors can enjoy, I also
mhm,
want to hear a few words about the incredible catalog that's been
mhm,
assembled for the exhibition.
mhm. Yeah, so we were very lucky to secure a number of incredible contributors to write for the catalog. It's a hardcover catalog. It's 222 pages. We have 12 essays in the catalog that cover almost as many topics as the exhibit.
Mhm.
And they include contributors like the curator of the Wyeth Collection at the Brandywine Museum, the curator of the art collection at the Boston Athenaeum, scholars in literature and film, art historians, scientists who are all writing from different perspectives. And then after that, there's about 150 pages of plates,
Yeah.
full color plates that include everything that was in the exhibition. But beyond that, and what I think is really special, it includes our sort of full wish list. So every object that we sort of considered or went after for the exhibition that for whatever reason couldn't be included, so it really is a kind of compendium or a full record of what the exhibition was, and also sort of beyond that, what we imagine the scope could be. So there's a lot of things in conversation with one another, and I'm very proud of it as a publication. I think it's
Uh,
sort of the go-to, hopefully now on your seaweed reading list if
Most
you had one.
definitely, most definitely. Um, would you please share some of the programming and events that you and others have created connected to the cultures of seaweed, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've had a lot of fun doing some pretty varied programming from family days oriented around inviting visitors to make their own sun prints with seaweed out on our front plaza space to tide pool explorations done in partnership with one of our local land trusts, to scholarly roundtables. For instance, we had one focused around the science of seaweed that included aquaculturists and lead scientists at WHOI and Marine Biological Laboratory. We have two more programs upcoming around seaweed in the month of October. We have one on October 5th, a roundtable focused on the art and culture of seaweed that will include myself and co-curator Maura Coughlin, who's an expert in French seaweed ways, as well as one of our contemporary artists in the exhibition, May Babcock, and our photography fellow here at the Museum, Marina Wells, who is also doing a dissertation on kind of coastal studies. Um, after that,
Yeah,
yeah,
please
after that
continue.
on October 21st, we'll be doing a full family day of programming in partnership with World Wildlife Foundation. That will include a lot of hands-on activities, and it will be particularly appropriate for children and kids at heart, shall we say.
Wonderful, wonderful. In closing, how can viewers and others keep informed about other current and upcoming developments at the New Bedford Whaling Museum?
That's a great question. We have a newsletter that goes out regularly. You don't need to be a member to get the newsletter. You can sign up right on our website and keep in touch with us that way. And then you'll get regular updates via email about what's happening. I will say our membership is also, quite approachable. So if you feel moved to become a member, that's another easy way to be sure you're getting our mailings as well, which include things like our twice annually published scholarly magazine, as well as annual reports and other kind of mail items.
Terrific, terrific. Well, Naomi, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you again so much for being here, for informing us about the cultures of seaweed. Definitely want to encourage viewers and others to make their way to the museum, still on exhibit for several more months till the early part of December. Look forward to visiting the museum again in the near future. Best of luck with all your future endeavors.
Well, thank you, Jay. This has been a pleasure.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.